Okay, so my first question is based on a quote, a snippet from your book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and I'll just read that. There was a time when I teetered precariously with an awkward foot in each of two worlds, the scientific and the indigenous. But then I learned to fly, or at least try. It was the bees that showed me how to move between different flowers, to drink the nectar and gather pollen from both. It is this dance of cross-pollination that can produce a new series of knowledge, a new way of being in the world, from page 47. So my first question is, how can science and religious or indigenous beliefs be balanced? And have you ever run into contradictions in your own life where you have realized that there's a disparity between your indigenous knowledge and scientific things that you might have been taught in school? And how did you learn to cope with that?
Sure. One clarification I want to make is when I was writing that about these two ways of knowing, I was thinking not of religion, but of Western science and indigenous knowledge, which is also sometimes called, part of that is indigenous science, overlain sometimes with spiritual understandings as well. And so having grown up with indigenous values and perspective, and also being trained in science, I think it's a very natural inclination to try to say, both what are the attributes of this way of knowing and of this way of knowing, and what would happen if we put them together. And so I'm really interested not in how they might blend with each other, but how they complement one another as sovereign bodies of knowledge. And science is so good at answering true false questions, right? Really good at that.
Yeah.
And indigenous knowledge, because it's more holistic, because it involves not only intellect and that which we can measure, but emotion and spirit as well as those things, that allows us to answer, is it a right or a wrong question? Not true, false, but what do we do with it? How do we incorporate it into how we are in the world? And science can't answer that question. Science can just tell us how the world is, but indigenous knowledge is, I think, uniquely equipped to say, well, what are we going to do about that?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I know that some people might not share the same indigenous background that you do, but they might struggle with balancing the scientific knowledge they learn in school with other cultural or religious backgrounds. What advice might you give to them about how to, I guess you said not blend, but allow these two different ways of understanding things to complement each other?
Yeah, and to coexist, right. That's a really important perspective. And I guess the way that I try to do it is to be as clear with myself as I can about what are the strengths that each of those bring. We say, well, this is what science can do, and this is what science can't do. Mm-hmm. This is what spiritual ways of understanding can do and can't do, and to deploy them appropriately. Right. But to have really great clarity about what they're each going to contribute. Otherwise, it gets really muddy and really confusing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So recognizing that many people create a binary between the environment and us as humans, what are ways that we can, what are steps that we can take in order to dissolve this perceived polarity and view ourselves as not supervisors or overseers of the environment, but rather as members?
That is one of the central questions of our time, isn't it? I'm glad you're asking that. To how do we start dissolving those boundaries? First of all, I think we have to recognize that this idea of human exceptionalism, that we are different, not only different, but better and superior and entitled to everything that the world offers us, more so than any other species. We just have to question that and to say, some people say, well, that's biological reality. No, it isn't. The science doesn't tell us that at all.
Right.
The science tells us that we are far more related to one another than we are different. The science is telling us that those things that we thought were unique about ourselves are in fact present in so many other realms of the world. So it's the idea of human exceptionalism that I think is really challenging. And a lot of it, I think, also has to do with viewing other species as sovereign entities, to say they have their own ways of being. They're not our ways of being, but they have their own ways of being. And if you ever feel, when I talk to people who say, well, I'm separate from nature, this humans and nature. We are nature, but if you ever doubt that, the simple act of breathing shows you how connected you are, right? When we breathe in, we're breathing in oxygen, right? And where did that oxygen come from?
Exactly.
It came from plants, right?
Yeah.
And when we breathe out, we're breathing out carbon dioxide, which is exactly what the plants need. This great chemical poem of exchange of gases reassures me every day that I am part of this whole thing.